final item of business today is members' business debate on motion number 3173 in the name of Rob Gibson on Remember Cunningham Graham. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons as soon as possible. Mr Gibson, if you are ready, 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's no easy task to summarise the adventurous life of Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham and explain why I believe that he deserves widespread recognition today. I'll explore the reasons why he has been neglected for decades and how his life is an inspiration to us today. Indeed, he ranks as a great Scot in our long history. On a monument erected a year after his death in 1936 at Dumbarton and now relocated to Gartmore, it reads, "Famous author, traveller and horseman, patriotic Scot and citizen of the world. He was a master of life and a king among men." Born in London in 24th May 1852, Robert was the eldest child. His father was an army officer, his mother part Spanish and Scots. He was aristocratic on all four sides, with long family connections to Finlaystone, Ardagh and Gartmore in the west of Scotland. He was directly descended from King Robert II of Scots via the defunct earldom of Menteith, which gave him a better claim to the throne than Queen Victoria. His ancestors were radically minded lairds on the lowland Highland border, where their 10,000 rushy acres around Gartmore and the Lake of Menteith produced little income and mounting debts. As children, he and his brothers would ride ponies around the Gartmore policies in summer. But he disliked English public schooling from experiences at Leamington Spa and Harrow. His family links to South America produced a bright boy who soon became fluent in Spanish. He received no classical university education but learned fencing and French at finishing school in Brussels. But as an adolescent, he saw his father become practically insolvent and thoroughly insane from wounds received on army duty in Ireland. Presiding Officer, unsure of a career in the army or an imperial service, Robert's express wish was to ranch in Argentina, and this turned into a lifelong love affair with the life on the Pampas and the wild mixed-race gauchos, the South American cowboys. For 7 years on and off, he spent time cattle and horse trading, whilst absorbing the atmosphere and the nature of the frontier in the young republics from Argentina to Brazil, hence the sobriquet Don Roberto. He sympathised with the marginalised, the downtrodden and victims of progress. Whether it was the Gauchos or the Sioux Indians or tribes across the globe, he became their political champion, and later in his extensive writings, which began after 6 years in the Imperial Parliament, that he dubbed the Theatre Royal Westminster. Robert eloped with a struggling actor he met in Paris. Gabriella de la Mondière was apparently a Chilean orphan, and they loved to travel and she to write on mystical subjects. Their visits to Texas, Mexico and Spain only ended with her early death in 1906, before he buried her on the Isle of Inchmahome, where he too is interred. The death of Robert's father in 1883 brought managerial responsibilities at Gartmore, and in the next few years an entry to active politics. He was finally elected as a Liberal MP for North West Lanarkshire in 1886, just when Lord Salisbury and the Tories won a 6-year term. His wit, his campaigns and outspoken style in the chamber championed the miners, the crofters, the dock workers and the chainmakers of Cradley Heath. He stood for Home Rule all round. He befriended Charles Stewart Parnell without agreeing on economic policies, and he promoted Keir Hardie. The collaboration of Graham and Hardie helped birth the Scottish Home Rule Association and the Scottish Labour Party in the late 1880s. Robert's forebears were radical liberals, and he himself opposed aggressive foreign policies and the game laws. He was for Scots and Irish Home Rule, graduated income tax, reform of the land laws, abolition of primogeniture and entail, free education and local options on the sale of liquor. That placed him as a substantial landowner campaigning against landlordism. Indeed, he did have to sell Gartmore in 1900. At Westminster, he quickly drew members' attention, where his speeches and suspensions became big news. He became the first socialist MP in a growing circle of varying degrees of fervour. For his part, he maintained a lifelong commitment to parliamentary democracy and the need for working people to be their own representatives. George Bernard Shaw captured his immortal phrase at one suspension, "I never withdraw," for his play Arms and the Man, in response to Graham's second suspension from the House for protesting against predatory Tory legislation that would have damaged the miners in his constituency. Failing to be re-elected in 1892, he began writing from early notes for his own amusement. He travelled and wrote many short stories and sketches which included acerbic political comments in many periodicals. By 1900, he was seen by others as a writer's writer. Presiding officer, this trenchant and humane writing inspired many in his wide circle of literary friends, in particular Joseph Conrad, who wrote The Heart of Darkness and Nostromo, both exposing the evils of imperialism and so-called progress in the Belgian Congo and South America. Robert's history of the Jesuits in Paraguay became the modern film The Mission. His histories of South American dictators warned the world in the 1920s and 30s against the rise of Hitler and Mussolini. That's why the Parliament should congratulate Alan McGilvray and John C. McIntyre on the publication by Kennedy and Boyd of Glasgow of the collected stories and sketches of R.B. Cunningham Graham in 5 volumes, in one modern edition published in the past year. Their 4 years of labour to present the works of one of Scotland's finest writers will allow modern audiences to enjoy and assess Cunningham Graham's place in Scotland's national literature. The golden thread of his life deserves new understanding and analysis. Many of the causes of his lifelong campaigns ring a bell for us today. Not least was his determination in later life to help found the National Party of Scotland in 1928 and become first president of the SNP in 1934. Hopefully, we share his concerns for the downtrodden and enjoy his descriptions of nature and the people of his native Menteith, or Morocco, or the Argentine Pampas, all lands threatened by the hand of progress, about which he was so sceptical. His writings should be known to all who value humanity and social justice today. Presiding officer, this motion calls on the Parliament and the Scottish Government to prepare appropriate celebrations in this year, the 160th anniversary of his birth. To help, I have secured, on top of this debate, a place in the Festival of Politics for further exploration of this adventurous life and the ideas of this famous Scot. I hope that the Parliament can honour Don Roberto by etching one of his trenchant quotes on the wall outside. I would modestly suggest, in these continued days of constitutional change, a phrase that he used in a rally at Stirling in 1930. He said, "The enemies of Scottish nationalism are not the English, for they were ever a great and generous folk, quick to respond when justice calls. Our real enemies are among us, born without imagination." I move this motion. Viva Cunningham Graham.
Thank you very much. I now call on Joan McAlpine to be followed by Patricia Ferguson. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm delighted to speak on the life of R.B. Cunningham Graham, and I congratulate my colleague Rob Gibson in securing the debate. Every article I have ever read on Cunningham Graham, from my time at university onwards, and every event like this debate, seems to seek to reclaim him from undeserved obscurity. We regularly rediscover him and then forget him just as quickly. But there is so much we should remember, in particular his campaigning on behalf of Lanarkshire miners, whom he was elected to represent as a Liberal in the 1880s, when there were still 300 boys under 12 who laboured in the pits beside adult men and women. In the space of a few weeks in 1887, he spoke at 60 meetings of Scottish miners to publish the Coal Mines Regulation Bill, and all 60 supported his 8-hour-day amendment. Unfortunately, he couldn't secure the support of Parliament. When MPs rejected the 8-hour amendment for the whole of Britain and Ireland, Cunningham Graham attempted to get an opt-out for Scotland, which was the the purpose of his public meetings in Lanarkshire, but that was voted down too, and for him it was a very strong vindication of his lifelong support for Home Rule, which was tied to his passion for social justice. In 1889, shortly after he entered the House of Commons, he said the demand for a Scottish Parliament came from, quote, the extreme misery of a certain section of the population and the wish to have their own MPs under their own hands in order to extort legislation to relieve that misery. 40 years later, he told the Reynolds Illustrated News that he wanted a Scottish Parliament to reduce unemployment, raise wages and nationalise the coal mines, all matters which would remain reserved to London today. However, he was not always so consistent. He was a colourful, mercurial and uncompromising character. For example, he hated Gladstone, his party leader, and boasted regularly of outstaring him in a meeting when the old leader had called him to give him a dressing down. He also described the Liberal leadership as timorous, miserable, inveterate animals who are really Tories at heart. He campaigned as a pacifist ahead of the outbreak of the First World War, and then volunteered to serve at the age of 62 when hostilities began in order to show solidarity with the troops at the front line. But it was his strong individualism which resulted in him being sent to prison for protesting against unemployment in Trafalgar Square, and it was the same rebel spirit that got him ejected from the Commons for the dreadful crime of using the word damn, no doubt in response to some injustice. Presiding Officer, I believe there are practical and economic reasons for our national amnesia about Cunningham Graham. The fires of our collected memory need to be fuelled with stories. When we had a vibrant newspaper and publishing industry here in Scotland, Cunningham Graham was a household name, and I too would congratulate the Glasgow publisher who has given us his collected works this year. But now the written word has been replaced by film, radio and TV as the main means of recording and sharing information and telling stories. There has been one good documentary on the man, The Adventures of Don Roberto, in 2008 on BBC Two Scotland only. Now compare that with the time devoted to Cunningham Graham's contemporaries, men that he inspired like William Morris and George Bernard Shaw, and other greats of Edwardian London and the late Victorian era, like the pre-Raphaelites and the early Bloomsbury set. Think about the amount of celebration and scrutiny through television, drama, debate and discussion. Modern Scotland must address this absence if we are to keep our culture and history alive, relevant and vibrant. Scottish studies in school will help, but we need to use the modern media as well, through a Scottish digital network which funds production for and about this country, and through better means of securing funding for films, a point made just this week on Good Morning Scotland by the Rob Roy producer, Peter Braun. Mr Braun for years has been trying to raise money to make James Hogg's Confessions of a Justified Sinner one of our greatest works of literature, which, like Cunningham Graham, has been unjustifiably marginalised, like so many other figures in our history and culture. Another filmmaker, Ken Loach, whose movie The Angels Share... You might be wishing to draw to a close soon, please. Whose movie The Angels Share also recently said that we needed to be telling more stories from Scotland, both on radio and TV. To conclude, R.B. Cunningham Graham's life could inspire dozens of different films and programmes, critical as well as celebratory. But the man who inspired Joseph Conrad's Nostromo and who has museums in his honour in Argentina is condemned to random rediscovery in his own land, and that is not acceptable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now call on Patricia Ferguson to be followed by Kevin Stewart. 4 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And may I begin by congratulating Rob Gibson for securing the motion before us this evening, and also for his tenacity in championing Robert Cunningham Graham. Now, Rob Gibson has suggested that a quote from Graham should be included with those that adorn the wall outside this place, and I have no problem with that. I would perhaps have a problem with the particular quotation he chose, however. But I would perhaps like to make another suggestion, and it consists of words that Cunningham Graham once used to begin a speech in Parliament, which might stand as a lesson to us all. On this particular occasion, the witty, urbane and passionate Graham announced to Parliament, "Gentlemen," for they were gentlemen, "I shall be brief, but tedious." Now, exhausting he may have been, but I would argue that Cunningham Graham was never tedious. And for too long he has been ignored by historians and biographers alike. And I'm very pleased that his contribution to literature is now being recognised, because his travel writing particularly is witty and stylish and resonates today because it speaks of countries which have changed so much since the time Graham was writing, but they still tell stories which have meaning to us today. But of course, Robert Bontyne Cunningham Graham, Don Roberto, was not only a writer. He was, as the late Caroline Benn described him, a fluent linguist, explorer, naturalist, and undoubtedly the most accomplished equestrian ever to enter Parliament. He was also an early supporter of animal welfare, an opponent of capital and corporal punishment. He was in favour of prison reform, as well as the free opening on Sundays of museums. He was hailed both as the first socialist MP and as the uncrowned King of Scotland, because, as Rob Gibson recognised earlier, he was a direct descendant of Robert II through the Earls of Menteith. He was dashing and rode a black horse everywhere he went. This horse, Pampa, was an Argentinian Mustang that he apparently discovered pulling a Glasgow tram. Now, that may sound unlikely, but so too does much else about this man's life. Apparently, Cunningham Graham immediately arranged to obtain the horse, and it even travelled by railway box to London, where it was reunited with its master, who then rode it into the stables at Westminster. So he was an extremely colourful character, but he also had an excellent political brain, and he became a mentor to Keir Hardie. And together they worked hard for the miners, for injustice wherever it was to be found, and for Home Rule. For 6 years they were inseparable, and it was said by Glazier that they went about in harness. That Graham influenced Hardie goes without question, but in the time remaining to me, Presiding Officer, I'd like to focus on one chapter of Graham's life that shows his commitment and his courage. During 1887, there were almost daily demonstrations in London on the issue of unemployment. The authorities eventually banned the use of Trafalgar Square, including an event on the 13th of November at which Cunningham Graham was to speak. That action of the authorities quickly turned this into a demonstration that was as much about free speech as it was about unemployment. Marchers converged in the city, and those coming from Battersea, Notting Hill and Rotherhithe were ambushed by police, and the army blocked all entrances to the square. Many marchers literally decided to turn and run, but not Graham or John Burns, his fellow speaker. They made their way, pushing and shoving to the front, and climbed onto a plinth to speak. Both men were stopped by the army, but not before they'd received heavy blows to the head. They were arrested and charged with infringing the Riot Act, and Graham received a sentence of 6 weeks, which he spent recovering from his head wound. He was later to claim that this prison was far more comfortable than the many he had experienced in his travels. This event was extremely embarrassing and depressing for the early progressive movement, but did lead to the creation of Britain's first Civil Liberties Association. Now, like Burns, Presiding Officer, there is something about Graham that can attract everyone from wherever they come in Scottish society. And while we may not all agree with all of his beliefs, he is someone whose place in Scotland's history should be better understood and better recognised. And I was delighted to find at the weekend that the copies of the novels that I have of Cunningham Graham and of his storybooks from years ago are now actually available on Kindle too. So I very much congratulate Rob Gibson again, but I do congratulate the publishers for their efforts to try to bring Cunningham Graham to a wider audience.
Thanks so much. Now calling Kevin Stewart, after which we'll move to the Minister for the closing speech.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I too congratulate Rob Gibson for bringing this debate to this Parliament. I have an admission, and I have to say that I had not really read very much of Cunningham Graham's works until this motion was actually lodged, and I think it's very sad that that is the case. However, I was aware of many of his quotations from the past. One of the most satirical was of Henry Campbell Bannerman. Graham says he has all the qualifications for a great Liberal Prime Minister. He wears spats and he has a beautiful set of false teeth. absolutely amazingly funny, in my opinion. G.K. Chesterton, who proclaimed him the prince of preface writers and famously declared in his autobiography that while Cunningham Graham would never be allowed to be Prime Minister, he instead achieved the adventure of being Cunningham Graham, which Shaw described as an achievement so fantastic that it would never be believed in a romance. I think that sums the man up, to be honest with you, Presiding Officer. Beyond that, I have to admit that I also missed a recent STV documentary, but it seems to have sparked quite a lot of debate in the internet and elsewhere. And some of that debate I actually found on the Greenock Morton fans website. Now, I have to say that one does not normally expect to find such debates on football supporters' websites, and I've certainly never seen one on the Don's website, it has to be said, Presiding Officer. The other thing which has always amazed me about Cunningham Graham is the amount of artists that either painted or sculpted the man, including Epstein, and there's a famous bust in Aberdeen Art Gallery, which is quite fantastic piece of work. Colleagues have already said quite enough about all of the things that Graham stood for and the things that he did in Parliament. But one of the pieces of writing which I found, which actually uses a word which we would no longer use to describe black people, and I won't use that in the quote, is a complete and utter attack on poverty, religious fundamentalism, racism, imperialism, and the grab for land and resources. And I'm going to quote a bit from that. The Malays, the Malagasy, Japanese, Chinese, Red Indians, as Sioux, Comanches, Navajos, Apaches, with Zapotecas, Esquimalt, and in the south are that N-word that I'm not going to say, so their hair is straight. Turks, Persians, Levantines, Egyptians, Moors, and generally all of those of almost any race whose skins are darker than our own, and whose ideas of faith, of matrimony, banking and therapeutics differ from those held by the dwellers of Primrose Hill, cannot escape. Men of the Latin races, though not born free, can purchase freedom with a price. That is, if they conform to our ideas, are rich and wash, ride bicycles and gamble on the stock exchange. If they are poor, then woe betide them. Let them paint their faces white with all the ceruse which ever Venice furnished. To the black favour shall they come. At times a thinking man knows scarcely what to think, and sometimes doubts whether God is the God we took him for, and if he is a fitting deity for us to worship. And if we had not better once for all get us a God of our own race and fitted for our own ways. As I say, an attack on poverty, religious fundamentalism, imperialism, racism, and the grab for land and resources. That, for me, shows that he held the belief that we are Jack Tamson's bairns. He was a believer in an independent Scotland and an immense internationalist, and I think we should all celebrate Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham.
Many thanks. Excellent. I now call on the Cabinet Secretary, Fiona Hislop, to close debate on behalf of the Government.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'd like to thank Rob Gibson for bringing this motion forward today to celebrate the life and works of Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham and to recognise the recent publication of his writings in a new collection for modern readers. Rob Gibson provided a truly very fitting and eloquent tribute. I'd also like to thank those members who have contributed to the debate this afternoon. Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham has been described by experts in Scottish literature as Scotland's forgotten personality, politician and writer, indeed as Joan McAlpine referred to, and indeed her interesting analysis of the need to tell stories in a modern context, so this no longer is the case. Cunningham Graham, however, is in every sense a remarkable individual. Born in London, as we've heard, with Spanish heritage, educated at Harrow, an adventurer in Morocco, a cowboy and long rider in the Americas, and passed away in Argentina. But through all of this, he was a Scot. The sheer scope of his life experience and the energy he devoted to everything he did was an inspiration. Joseph Conrad once said that, "When I think of Cunningham Graham, I feel as though I have lived all my life in a dark hole without seeing or knowing anything. Cunningham Graham was noted as an inspiration and influence for Conrad's famous books The Heart of Darkness and Nostromo. His notable friends, as we've heard, extend well beyond Conrad to include the likes of Charles Stewart Parnell, George Bernard Shaw and Buffalo Bill. Don Roberto, as he became known in the Americas, inspired by both deed and word. In Argentina, he was a champion of miners, the Gauchos, the Native Americans and many others whom he considered were exploited by the wealthy and privileged. His influence on modern Scottish political life cannot be underestimated. Entering the House of Commons in 1886 as a Liberal MP for Lanarkshire and left in 1892 as that Parliament's first sitting Socialist member. His electoral platform, we've heard much of that today, was considered radical at the time. Universal suffrage, free school meals, free education, an 8-hour working day, Home Rule for Scotland and the abolition of the House of Lords. Well, 4 out of 5 ain't bad, Presiding Officer. On leaving Parliament, Cunningham Graham's spirit of adventure continued. He moved to Spain to prospect for gold, perhaps a unique undertaking for a former MP. Not content to being a founder of the Scottish Labour Party, as we heard from Patricia Ferguson with Keir Hardie, Cunningham Graham went on to found the Scottish National Party. His view was that nationalism and the establishment of a Scottish Parliament with full control over all Scottish affairs was needed to further internationalism. Now, the Chamber won't be surprised that I and many of my colleagues most certainly agree with that. And as Cabinet Secretary for Culture and External Affairs, I was also pleased to remember R.B. Cunningham's literary work. In nearly 30 books, including 200 short stories and sketches, history and travel books, he draws upon his many travels and adventures in Scotland and his beloved South America as inspiration. Alan McGilvray, one of the editors of the recent publication which brings together R.B. Cunningham Graham's writing, notes that Graham's image has followed a perhaps sadly familiar trajectory, from being a very high-profile politician, esteemed writer and traveller, a flamboyant anti-establishment public figure known by his exotic nickname of Don Roberto, in tribute to his passionate Hispanic attachments, to being a dimly recognised name from the past, one of the great neglected bands to be found within any literary tradition. A monument in Dumbarton was erected for Cunningham Graham, symbolising his adventures and his life and his Scottish heart. The memorial cairn was established a year after Graham's death in 1936. The cairn has stones from Argentina, Uruguay and Paraguay, where he lived and worked as a gaucho and writer. The inscription on the cairn briefly covers this life, reading Robert Bonteen Cunningham Graham, 1852 to 1936. Famous author, traveller and horseman, patriotic Scot and citizen of the world, as betokened by the stones above. Died in Argentina, interred in Inchmahome. He was a master of life, a king among men. And I know Rob Gibson read that out, but I think it's worth repeating. What a remarkable tribute for any man. The monument moved this year to the village of Gartmore after a spate of vandalism has been restored to its former glory by custodians at the National Trust for Scotland. And in light of all this, today's debate is welcome and timely. It will help to set the record straight. It gives the rightful place to this committed champion of the people of Scotland and their home rule. Both culturally and politically, he can rightly be considered one of modern Scotland's founding fathers. I wish to add my warm congratulations to Alan McGilvray and John C. McIntyre on the fruits of their work over a number of years, which has led to the publication by Kennedy and Boyd of the collected stories and sketches of R.B. Cunningham Graham in 5 volumes. This, Presiding Officer, is the most fitting testimony to the literary contribution of any writer. The collection bringing together R.B. Cunningham Graham's short stories, sketches and essays for the very first time for modern readers. The availability of easily accessible editions will give modern readers the opportunity to assess and enjoy the remarkable range of this significant Scottish writer's work. And in time, scholars may reveal why R.B. Cunningham Graham's work has received so little serious attention in the 75 years since his death. But our responsibility is to make sure that neglect itself becomes history. Unquestionably, he was a master of life. And indeed, suggestions about words on the Parliament would be very fitting. And indeed, if we can secure cross-party support for that, I think that is very worthwhile taking forward. Patricia Ferguson talked about what inspired and motivated Cunningham Graham. The miners, Home Rule and injustice. And in listening to that, these are the same issues that motivated me to get involved in politics, and indeed may have inspired many people in this chamber likewise to become politically involved. So the political thread is still there, and it binds us together, and a memory which truly inspires. And I think it's very important today, Presiding Officer, that we do pay tribute to this inspiration of a man in this debate, and I hope in the years to come. Thank you.
Many, many thanks. I now close this meeting of Parliament.